Suho spoke with confidence, suggesting that Director Kim should definitely give a scholarship. He seemed sure of himself, even though it might be hard for a complete beginner to come first in the exam. But he wasn't just a beginner, he was an experienced hunter who had already conquered many gates. Now, though, it was up to Director Kim whether she chose to believe him. Director Kim adjusted her glasses and pointed out the difficulties ahead, mentioning that the hunter test was very different from conquering a gate, even if it was something never seen before. She showed Suho a report with statistics about the hunter test, explaining that the average pass rate was under 20%, and this year's pass rate was only 15%. Suho just smiled at this. Then he made a suggestion. If he didn't come in first, she could forget about him and not give him the scholarship. Director Kim paused and then asked him why, out of all the academies like Hexagon and Prime, he had chosen Nexus. Suho explained that he picked Nexus because it was in the most disappointing situation. Director Kim blinked in surprise at this answer. She might have wanted to slap him for his boldness. Suho went on to say that Nexus Academy was the biggest in the country, but recently it hadn't produced any first or second place winners, and the number of students was dropping. Director Kim sighed, admitting that this was true. As Director Kim adjusted her glasses, she thought about what Suho had said. They really needed to show better results, but there was no outstanding student yet. What if she accepted Suho's offer, and he actually came out on top? The one who conquered the Syndrome Station Gate and passed the hunter test with the highest score. If news like that spread, Nexus Academy would benefit a lot. It was an attractive idea. Then, there was just one more thing to figure out. Director Kim asked Suho how much money he expected from the scholarship. Suho asked how much the scholarship for the top student was. Director Kim explained that the top student would get a full refund of their tuition fees for the year, plus a 30 million won congratulatory bonus. On top of that, the top student could immediately join the Nexus Guild if they wanted. Suho nodded in approval. It was exactly what he expected from the largest academy. However, Director Kim suspected that Suho might not have expected such a large amount. She casually asked him how much he would honestly want. Suho thought for a moment, then smiled. He suggested 300 million won, considering the rewards of being the top student and the size of Nexus Academy. He pointed out that 300 million won wasn't much for a big academy like Nexus. Director Kim looked surprised at the amount, but after a moment, she nodded, agreeing to his proposal. All right, Director Kim said, nodding. She made an offer to Suho. If he passed as the top test taker, she would pay him 300 million won. She suggested they draft a contract, and for now, she asked Suho to take a look around the academy. The scene shifted to a new location near a clock tower, as evening turned into night. Suho admired the sight of the vast academy grounds, thinking about how huge Nexus was. It seemed even bigger than an amusement park. He realized that once he enrolled, he wouldn't have to worry about anything. Nearby, a man laughed, clearly excited about the academy, saying it was the largest in South Korea. As Suho and the man walked together, Suho's thoughts wandered. He noticed someone off in the distance, training on the playground. It was hard to see clearly, but it looked like a student. The man guiding him commented that the person training was Daehan, the most dedicated student. Suho raised an eyebrow and asked, "Is he training like that every day?" The man nodded, confirming that Daehan trained at this hour regularly. Suho watched as Daehan practiced with a weapon, swinging it precisely. The man called out to Daehan, reminding him that while practice was important, he also needed to take care of his body. Daehan turned toward them, smiling confidently, and said that, as a third-year student, he needed to work even harder. Suho watched Daehan closely and immediately recognized him. He remembered forming raid parties with Daehan in his previous life. Back then, Daehan had become the top tanker in the country, famous for his incredible mental strength and defense. It was unfortunate that the role of pure tankers had faded over time. Suho's eyes fell on the battle axe Daehan was holding. It was different from the shield that had suited him so well in the past. It seemed Daehan hadn't yet found his true calling. Suho saw this as an opportunity. Since Daehan would eventually join Nexus in the future, Suho thought it would be smart to connect with him now and later bring him into the Korean Hunter Association. Suho smiled and introduced himself as an Suho. They exchanged greetings, and Suho looked at the battle axe Daehan was holding. With curiosity, he asked if Daehan planned to use the axe as his main weapon. Daehan looked a bit unsure but explained enthusiastically that he aimed to be a melee user. Daehan had consulted others, and they had recommended the battle axe. They told him that weapons like that needed to match one's physique from the beginning, and in terms of destructive power, nothing could match a battle axe. Suho then asked if Daehan had only been using the battle axe, and Daehan nodded. He admitted that he was a bit slow to learn and that it had taken him 2 years to become proficient with it. Suho felt a bit lost for words and suddenly had a slight headache. He thought to himself that the real problem was that the battle axe didn't match Daehan's natural abilities. He wasn't sure if it was persistence or just stubbornness, but Daehan should have switched weapons earlier if he wasn't improving. Daehan noticed Suho was deep in thought and asked if something was wrong. Suho, still serious, thought about how the largest academy in the country seemed surprisingly lax. He then suggested Daehan should use a weapon he felt comfortable with. After all, players could adjust their stats, and with the skill correction effect, they could quickly improve proficiency. Suho pointed out that the battle axe didn't seem to suit Daehan. Daehan seemed confused, so Suho explained that the fact it had taken Daehan 2 years to get good with the battle axe showed a lack of synergy between Daehan and the weapon. Suho explained further, while the battle axe was powerful, the delay after each attack was too long. If there were no way to deal with that gap, Daehan would be vulnerable to counterattacks. He also noted that Daehan's large size made him difficult to protect by a tank if he was using a heavy weapon like the battle axe. Daehan was surprised by Suho's observations. He admitted that he'd been using the battle axe for 3 years and now felt like all that time might have been wasted. Suho reassured him, saying that if Daehan had been able to handle an unsuitable weapon for so long, it was likely that his true skills were more suited for being a tank. A tank? Daehan repeated, clearly surprised. Suho nodded and suggested Daehan try using a kite shield on his left arm and a one-handed bludgeon in his right hand. He added that Daehan's practical scores would probably improve significantly with this change. Daehan hesitated, asking if it wasn't too late to switch, especially with the test the next day. Suho asked him what he thought was the most important role in a party. Daehan guessed it was the mage, but Suho shook his head. He explained that the real core of a party was the tank, who had to draw aggro and protect the mage and healer for everything to function properly. Suho encouraged Daehan to wield a shield and use another weapon to control crowds in various ways. Daehan nodded slowly, starting to understand the reasoning. Daehan smiled and said he would give it a try. Suho praised him for not getting discouraged and for making such a smart decision so quickly. Daehan thanked Suho and walked away, eager to practice. As Daehan left, the man guiding Suho turned to him and asked if he was an instructor. Suho looked surprised and shook his head, saying he wasn't. The man then commented that Suho seemed to have a deep understanding of weapon synergy and hunter advice, which was unusual for someone without a license. Suho smiled and replied that he wasn't an instructor, but he knew a bit about that area. Wanting to change the subject, he asked if the contract was ready, since some time had passed. The man nodded, saying he had just received a call about it and suggested they head back to the director's office. The scene shifted to the next day, under a clear morning sky. The South Korea Hunter Association was busy with examinees, all holding their weapons and getting ready for the hunter's license test. Everyone looked like they were in peak condition, except for one person. Suho, the lone conqueror of the gate, sat there looking exhausted. He muttered to himself that he was tired from wandering around too much the day before. Around him, many people had gathered. Candidates were lined up, waiting for their turn to take the preliminary drug test, which was meant to catch any instances of doping. The announcer's voice echoed through the facility, telling everyone to line up by their assigned numbers. Suho, already tired from the long day, sighed inwardly and rubbed his temple. Although the doping test was necessary, it felt like an extra burden on top of everything else. He looked up, and his eyes briefly glowed blue, showing his special ability. Suho knew that drug tests alone wouldn't catch everything. Those who cheated often use skill buffs, not just conventional drugs, to gain an unfair advantage. His eyes scanned the room, and he noticed a glow around several people, indicating that they had been buffed far beyond the normal level 5 of a test taker. These weren't just average candidates. Their magical energy was much stronger because of the buffs. A system notification flashed before his eyes, congratulating him on mastering magic detection rank B. This new skill made his perception sharper, making it even easier to spot those who were cheating. Suho frowned, his mood darkening. It was disappointing to see so many people abusing buffs, even though the use of such abilities for cheating hadn't yet become widely known. Suho made a decision right then that something had to be done about it. His gaze moved up to the balcony, where he saw team leader ᴄᴏᴘᴘыឫ waving at him excitedly. Suho allowed himself a small smile. At least there was one person he could trust here. As Suho waited, he overheard some of the other candidates talking among themselves. They were complaining about how difficult the written exam was, with one candidate worrying that they might need to retake it. Another agreed, saying that the exam was insanely hard. Suho couldn't help but feel a little smug. Thanks to the library of memories, he had sailed through the exam without any trouble. He almost felt like a cheater himself, but for a very different reason. Just then, a familiar voice called out to him, snapping him out of his thoughts. Suho looked up to see ᴄᴏᴘᴘᴘ approaching with a warm and friendly expression. ᴄᴏᴘᴘ asked how the test had gone, clearly curious. Suho just shrugged and said he thought he could pass it. ᴄᴏᴘᴘ chuckled, commenting on Suho's confidence. He added that word had spread that this year's written exam had been the hardest one yet. Then, ᴄᴏᴘᴘ got more serious, mentioning Suho's earlier comment about buff checks. He asked Suho what he had meant by that. Suho nodded thoughtfully and explained that while there were measures in place to prevent doping, like urine tests, blood tests, and confiscating belongings, he had noticed there were no checks for skill-related cheating. He suggested that conducting a magic detection scan could help spot anyone using illegal buffs. ᴄᴏᴘ's eyes widened slightly, and he thanked Suho for the information. He promised to look into it before the practical test began. As he turned to leave, he paused and looked back at Suho. ᴄᴏᴘ expressed that he personally hoped Suho would succeed, saying he would love to work with him in the association. He encouraged Suho to do his best in the practical test. Suho nodded, appreciating the encouragement. It felt good to know someone was rooting for him. Just then, the loudspeaker crackled to life, drawing everyone's attention. The announcement informed the candidates that the test would be delayed by 2 hours due to issues with the dive capsules. They were told to have lunch in the cafeteria and wait in the lounge or training area for a while. Suho sighed in relief. The delay would give ᴄᴏᴘ more time to implement the buff check, which might make the test fairer for everyone. With 1,200 candidates and a passing rate under 10%, Suho guessed that the cheater purge could bring the pass rate down even further, maybe to 7%. But that would mean the candidates who passed were truly the best, and Suho liked the idea of being surrounded by top talent. He decided to use the extra time to keep an eye on the other candidates. Maybe there was someone among them worth noticing. Suddenly, Suho's attention was drawn to a commotion. A young man was approaching a much larger candidate, challenging him to a sparring match. The young man's voice was loud enough to attract everyone's attention as he insisted on having a match. The larger man looked clearly annoyed, demanding to know who the challenger was and telling him to get lost. But the challenger persisted, saying he didn't want to fight, just spar. He taunted the larger man, implying he was scared to show his skills. Suho watched with mild amusement. It was always interesting to see how hunters interacted. Sometimes, a small confrontation could reveal a lot about a person's true character. The larger man, clearly agitated, muttered under his breath, calling the challenger a nuisance and telling him to leave. The larger man added that he had no interest in picking a fight with a weakling. The young man, however, refused to back down. He took a step forward, suggesting that he might just attack first. With the tension rising, the young man lunged aggressively at the larger candidate, forcing the big man to react. The clash was sudden. The young man swung his sword powerfully toward his opponent. But before the blow could connect, Suho stepped in, blocking the sword with his own. The larger man looked at Suho in surprise, asking if he had lost his mind. Suho remained calm and assured the man that he would handle the challenger, and that there was no need for things to escalate further. The challenger, clearly agitated, demanded to know who Suho was. Suho explained that he was just another test-taker, and that nothing good would come from getting involved in a fight. He suggested the bigger man leave it to him to handle the situation. The larger man huffed in frustration, muttering that he didn't care either way, and turned away. But the young man wasn't satisfied. He asked Suho why he was interfering, his irritation clear in his voice. Suho smiled and introduced himself as an Suho, remarking that it seemed like the young man was looking for a sparring partner. He offered to be that partner instead. The young man sneered, dismissing Suho as weak and saying he had no interest in sparring with someone like him. Suho's eyes widened slightly at the insult. He was a bit taken aback by the comment. The young man, now more confident, mocked Suho further, suggesting that the earlier block had just been luck and warning him not to get cocky. Suho looked thoughtful for a moment, then tilted his head and asked if the young man was scared. The young man's face twisted with anger, and he demanded to know what Suho had just said. Suho repeated himself calmly, suggesting that it seemed like the young man was too scared to spar with him. The provocation worked, and the young man, now furious, declared that he was ready to teach Suho a lesson. He had been bored anyway, surrounded by cowards, and now Suho had just made himself the perfect target to be a punching bag. Suho smiled, pleased that the young man had accepted his challenge. Around them, people began murmuring, suggesting they should head to the sparring arena and get the supervisor's approval for an official match. The group moved to a large, empty arena, bright and open, with spectators casually gathering in the stands to watch. Some onlookers shook their heads, commenting on how unnecessary it was to cause a scene on such an important day. Others dismissed the participants as attention seekers. An official stepped forward as Suho and the young man prepared for the sparring match. The official explained that only training weapons provided by the association would be allowed and that he would stop the match if things got out of hand. He then gave a quick signal, declaring the sparring match to begin. The two competitors faced each other, each wielding a wooden sword. The atmosphere grew tense as the two opponents engaged in a rapid exchange, their movements quick and powerful. Park Young, the young man, swung his sword aggressively, trying to overpower Suho with sheer force. But Suho moved with practiced ease, blocking each strike with precision while keeping a close eye on his opponent. Frustrated, Park Young shouted that he would tear Suho apart. He lunged forward again, but Suho easily blocked the attack. Suho looked at him with a mix of surprise and disappointment, asking, "Why are you so weak?" Park Young's expression turned to one of disdain as he remarked that his opponent was hardly worth the effort. Enraged, Park Young began shouting insults at Suho, his rage evident in every word. Suho, feeling the tension thick in the air, took a moment to study the person in front of him. That's when the memories hit him. He recognized Park Young. The young swordsman wasn't just any competitor, he was someone Suho had encountered before. Park Young was a skilled swordsman, known for his fierce energy and his eyes burning with an insatiable thirst for power. Suho recalled the red mist that would swirl around him, a sign of the intense desire for strength that fueled his every move. Once, Park Young had been driven by the desire to become stronger, always seeking out the fiercest opponents in order to hone his skills. But over time, his obsession with power had led him down a darker path, turning him into a feared hunter-killer. Relentless in his pursuit of dominance, Park Young had lost himself in his quest. Suho's gaze narrowed as he recognized the same fire in Park Young's eyes. This was a man who could be so much more, but only if he didn't allow that thirst for power to consume him. Suho knew he had to intervene before Park Young made the same mistakes that had led to his downfall in the past. He smirked, the memories of their previous encounters flashing in his mind. Park Young had been formidable before, but Suho now saw the raw, unrefined nature of his skills. He wasn't yet the powerhouse Suho remembered. He was still struggling, still lacking the experience and refinement that would turn him into a true master. Suho sighed. It was strange to see Park Young here, in this test arena, in such a state. Despite his raw power, the swordsman still lacked control. Suho moved swiftly, stepping forward and landing a solid kick to Park Young's chest, sending him flying backward across the arena. Park Yong's fall was dramatic, his body crashing to the ground with a loud thud. Suho remained standing, his expression bored as he looked down at his opponent. He couldn't help but mock Park Yong's earlier confident words, thinking to himself that he had expected more from him. Park Yong struggled to his feet, eyes wide with disbelief and pain. His breathing was heavy as he looked at Suho, still trying to process the strength he had just witnessed. His voice was thick with frustration as he demanded to know how Suho possessed such strength. Suho merely shrugged, a casual smile on his face as he suggested that rushing at him wouldn't work. He asked Park Yong if he really wanted to continue, observing his stance. Suho quickly realized that this was likely Park Yong's first time facing a level 10 opponent, as the strongest he'd probably fought before had been a level 5. Despite the setback, Park Yong wasn't discouraged. A smirk appeared on his lips as he saw something intriguing in Suho, something he hadn't encountered in a long time. He remarked that now he understood why Suho had been so relaxed. The tension in the air thickened as Park Yong prepared himself for another round. His grip on his sword tightened, and his eyes gleamed with a renewed determination. He declared that he would give it his all this time. Suho watched him carefully as Park Yong began to gather his energy. A red aura swirled around him, and Suho couldn't help but smile, almost amused, as if humoring a child. With a shout, Park Yong launched himself at Suho, his sword cutting through the air with intense force. The two clashed in a blur of rapid movements. The sound of their weapons striking echoed across the arena, each swing carrying the weight of their power. For a moment, Park Yong seemed to push Suho back, their energies colliding like waves crashing against a rock. Suho could feel the weight behind Park Yong's strikes, acknowledging that they were definitely heavier than before. Park Yong, panting, sneered at Suho, his frustration clear as he asked if Suho would continue to act so relaxed. His red aura flared up even more, intensifying as he prepared for a decisive blow. He roared, daring Suho to stop his next attack. Suho's eyes widened slightly as Park Yong assumed a new stance. He recognized it immediately. It was the dragon sword technique, the technique Suho knew all too well. With a powerful shout, Park Yong launched his attack. His sword came down with lightning speed, aiming straight for Suho. The collision of their forces caused a massive explosion, blinding light filling the arena. For a moment, it seemed like Park Yong had succeeded. He stood panting, a smug smile on his face as he muttered to himself that he had won. But as the light faded, Suho remained standing, his sword held firmly in his hand, having blocked the attack with ease. He sighed lightly and grinned, meeting Park Yong's shocked gaze. He commented that he had blocked the strike without much effort. He could even do it with his eyes closed. Park Yong's eyes were wide with disbelief. He stammered, trying to process how Suho had managed to stop him. Suho, however, quickly analyzed the attack. It wasn't truly the dragon sword technique, not yet. What Park Yong had used was a basic sword technique, though with some flair. Wounded in his pride, Park Yong let out a furious shout, calling Suho a bastard. But Suho didn't react to the insult. Instead, he simply stood ready for the next round. The fight raged on, with Park Yong attacking with relentless force. His sword swung with all the power he could muster, the red energy around him growing brighter with each strike. Suho was momentarily pushed back, but he remained calm, carefully watching for an opening. When Park Yong saw Suho being forced back, he believed he had found his opportunity. He lunged forward, throwing everything he had into one final strike. Suho, however, blocked it effortlessly, as if it was nothing. Before Park Yong could react, Suho stepped forward and delivered a swift punch to his jaw. Park Yong stumbled backward, his head spinning from the force of the blow. Park Yong staggered, his vision swimming from the punch. He muttered in disbelief, struggling to stay upright, wondering how Suho had managed it. Suho simply shook his head, remarking that Park Yong's attacks were too slow. Without a second word, Suho watched as Park Yong flew across the arena, landing with a thud. He took a moment to breathe, realizing it was time to finish this. He didn't want to break Park Yong's spirit too much. There was no need to cause any more damage to his confidence. The arena went quiet. Suho stood still and composed while Park Yong lay on the ground, unconscious. Suho considered what had just happened. Park Yong had potential, but his obsession with power was his downfall. Suho reflected on his past life and how things had turned out for Park Yong. He couldn't let history repeat itself, not this time. The past was filled with regrets, but the present offered a chance to change things. Suho knew Park Yong's fixation on him would make him obsessed until he managed to defeat him. But Suho was confident that would never happen. Suho thought the testing center would become quieter now, and with that in mind, he called out for the supervisor. The supervisor responded, clearly shocked, but he quickly got a handle on the situation. Suho explained he'd accidentally knocked Park Yong out and requested the supervisor take care of him until he woke up. The supervisor, nervous but understanding, promised to handle it. Suho nodded and turned his attention to the test area, where technicians were hard at work. The high-tech lab was filled with activity, and there were dive capsules set up in rows. Suho observed closely, noting the presence of more skilled technicians than usual. He suspected that some of them might be undercover doping inspectors, keeping an eye out for candidates who might be using illegal buffs. Suho overheard a nearby conversation between a technician and a candidate. The technician was calming the candidate, explaining that they weren't compatible with the current capsule and directing them to another. Suho found it odd but didn't think much of it. It was then his turn to undergo the test. A technician gestured for him to lie down in one of the capsules. Suho did so without hesitation. The technician gave him instructions, advising him to press a button if he felt any discomfort or unusual sensations during the dive. Suho nodded to show he understood. The technician initiated the process, and the capsule's interface lit up, showing the dive progress. A voice from the system announced that the Hunter Practical Test program was now active. The progress bar showed as the connection to Suho's consciousness was established. Once completed, the system confirmed that the Healer Practical Test scenario was now starting. The environment around Suho shifted as the test began. Suho focused his mind, preparing himself for the challenge ahead. This was a test not just of his fighting skills, but his potential to be a healer, an integral role in any party. He steadied his breath, ready for what was to come. Suho found himself standing in the middle of a desolate, reddish cityscape. The buildings around him were crumbling, debris scattered everywhere, and the entire place gave off an eerie, lifeless vibe. He couldn't help but think that this exam was notoriously difficult, especially given the low pass rate for healers. As he took in the ruined surroundings, his attention was drawn to a young girl kneeling on the ground, crying. She appeared to be injured, and instinctively, Suho moved toward her. The whole scene felt unnervingly real, with distant screams echoing in the air, adding to the grim atmosphere. Suho's mind raced as he took in the devastation around him. How had the Great Hunter Association managed to create such an intense, chaotic scenario? It felt less like an exam and more like an ordeal designed to break you. He muttered to himself, bitterly noting that the association had no sense of moderation. The test seemed tailored to traumatize candidates, and Suho felt a wave of fatigue and frustration creep over him. Sighing deeply, he clenched his fist. He knew why healers were so highly valued. They were always at the heart of the chaos, expected to provide life-saving support even in the most dire of situations. Healers had to be strong, not in the way of warriors or mages, but in their resilience and selflessness. It was a role that required sacrifice. But that didn't make it any less daunting. The practical test was the true measure of a hunter's ability, where their class and skills were truly put to the test. For combatants, warriors, mages, archers, it was all about fighting, surviving, and defeating as many enemies as possible. The scenarios were constantly shifting, with different criteria for passing each year. It wasn't just about winning, it was about how well they handled various threats, the number of enemies they took down, and how long they survived. But for healers, the test was different. It wasn't about defeating enemies or outlasting opponents. It was about selflessness and sacrifice. A healer who could perform well in combat was important, but what mattered more was their willingness to risk their life for others, to protect and save those in need, no matter the cost. Suho understood that this was the essence of healing. The score was never just about magical proficiency, it was about putting others before yourself, even if it meant dying in the process. He braced himself, knowing what the test would likely demand of him. Healers often had to sacrifice themselves for their patients in this simulation. Healers who died trying to save someone were often the ones who scored the highest. It was a challenge unlike anything faced by combat-oriented classes. The thought of dying for the sake of the test didn't sit well with Suho, but he knew the system had revived him once before. If necessary, he would bend the rules. As he approached the sword embedded in the ground nearby, Suho's lips curled into a faint smile. The notion of being expected to die willingly for the test seemed absurd, but if it came down to it, he would find a way to survive. He wasn't just any healer. Suddenly, desperate cries filled the air, snapping Suho out of his thoughts. He turned sharply, listening intently to the screams that seemed to reverberate all around him. But when he looked, all he saw was death. Bodies littered the ground, fallen figures frozen in terror, their faces locked in their final moments of agony. The entire simulation area felt like a battlefield, where no hope remained and only one survivor was left standing. Suho moved closer to the girl he had seen earlier. Kneeling beside her, he took a moment to assess the situation. The girl's eyes were still wide open, filled with fear and uncertainty. Suho crouched down beside her, gently asking if she was okay as he examined her injuries. Her voice trembled as she struggled to speak, warning him in a hushed tone that the enemies would return and they needed to leave before it was too late. Suho gave her a reassuring smile, shaking his head. He told her that rescue teams were on the way, that she would be safe soon, and that he'd protect her until they arrived. His resolve solidified in that moment. He would protect her, no matter what. Back in the real world, the exam facility was a hive of activity. Pods filled the room, each occupied by an examinee immersed in their own simulation. One test taker stepped out of his pod, rubbing his neck in discomfort, muttering to himself that he could have done more. His expression was a mix of exhaustion and disappointment. A staff member, a woman in a neat uniform, offered him a warm smile and thanked him for his effort, instructing him to gather his belongings and head home. The man nodded, still lost in his thoughts as he made his way out. Nearby, his results flashed on a screen. Kong Jin Young, class, archer, time, 9 minutes, 4 seconds. The woman glanced at the scores, sighing as she noted how low they were for this season. The difficulty must have been particularly high this year, she murmured, before asking another staff member, Director Shin, about the status of Suho's simulation. Director Shin glanced at his screen and answered that Suho had been in his pod for quite some time. The woman was surprised. "It's been 30 minutes, she remarked, noting that most candidates usually spent no more than 15 minutes in the simulation. She leaned closer to the screen, confirming the time, 30 minutes and 21 seconds. Her eyes widened in disbelief. Who is this person? Both Director Shin and the woman turned their attention to the real-time feed of Suho's simulation. On the screen, Suho was wielding a sword, cutting down monsters with ease, all while keeping the injured girl safe. The woman, impressed, commented that he was a fantastic fighter and asked if he was a warrior. Director Shin shook his head, pointing to the screen. "No, he's actually a healer." The woman scoffed, clearly disbelieving. "A healer? But he's holding a sword." Director Shin motioned for her to look more closely. As she did, she saw that Suho wasn't just fighting. He was seamlessly blending in healing magic, pausing between each sword swing to mend the girl's wounds and protect her from the advancing creatures. His movements were precise, and his attention never wavered from the injured girl. The woman couldn't help but be stunned. This is incredible. A healer fighting like this? She paused, then questioned, "Isn't he supposed to be disqualified for not dying? I thought they usually wanted the healer to sacrifice themselves." Director Shin explained that there was no reason for disqualification. The goal for a healer is to protect the patient to the very end. That's what Suho is doing, and he's doing it perfectly. He's fulfilling all the requirements of the test. The screen showed Suho blocking more monster attacks, staying by the girl's side, never abandoning her. He kept healing her at every opportunity, his focus never shifting from his patient's well-being. The woman watched in awe as Suho fought with such skill while ensuring the girl stayed safe, her injuries healing with each passing moment. Director Shin highlighted that Suho was fulfilling all the necessary criteria for the test. He was staying close to his patient, healing her when necessary, and putting his life at risk to protect her. Since he met all the conditions, there was no reason for him to be disqualified. Even the practical system itself did not intervene. The woman nodded, slowly realizing that the top candidate in this practical exam had likely already been determined. In the simulation, Suho stood in the now darkened, ruined landscape, his sword tightly gripped in his hands. Several small green lizard-like creatures emerged from the shadows, their movements hostile and quick. Suho surveyed them calmly, unsheathing his sword in one fluid motion. As the creatures charged toward him, he responded with precision, slicing through all of them in a single strike. He muttered to himself, feeling that it wasn't quite enough. His movements weren't fast enough. He needed to be quicker. So, he pushed himself further, speeding up his attacks. His body moved fluidly, evading their strikes as he sliced through them with a grace and power that spoke of years of experience. As the last creature fell, a system notification flashed before him. The system acknowledged Suho's exceptional grasp of the footplay technique and congratulated him for mastering it. Suho smiled with satisfaction. Even in this virtual reality, the system was able to detect his skill level. He knew how the system operated, monitoring his movements, acknowledging his mastery, and rewarding his progression. Though the experience gains were slower here compared to real physical exertion, it was still an ideal training environment. As Suho continued to fight, he felt a surge of progress. Along with his mastery of footplay, he upgraded all the swordsmanship skills he had gained to rank A. It wasn't providing experience points or items, but the feeling of improvement was rewarding enough. Another notification flashed, congratulating him for upgrading his horizontal slash to a rank. Suho envisioned his skill set as a grid, considering the potential growth of his abilities. If he could upgrade every fundamental sword skill to a rank or higher, he knew he could eventually access a technique as powerful as Park Yong's Dragon Sword technique. Suddenly, the system notification changed. It pulsed with a brilliant, glowing energy, unlike any notification he had seen before. Light enveloped Suho as the system informed him that his understanding of swordsmanship surpassed anyone else's. The system was impressed with his unique approach and offered to integrate his fundamental sword techniques and footplay into a new skill. Once registered, this new skill would have its own rank, and he could even name it himself. Suho's eyes gleamed with determination as a satisfied smile spread across his face. This was the moment he had been waiting for. With a calm, assured voice, he whispered, "Welcome back, my sword, my guardian sword."